Hi, this is Dr. Anthony Edwards, and I'm the instructor for higher education finance. And today we're going to be talking about revenue and cost slash expenditure structures in higher education. So the first thing we're going to talk about are expenses and how do you classify them. And the authors talk about natural versus functional classification. So when you're talking about natural classification, we're talking about the purpose of the funding, or the expense, things like instruction, student services, that's natural classification. If we're talking about the activity supported, that's functional classification. Examples of that are utilities and compensation. So, in terms of math or equations, if you think about how to find the total revenue, we're talking about price times quantity. So, to simplify that, price, you might think about tuition, and quantity might be the number of students, right? And so that's one way of calculating the revenue from tuition, and you would essentially do that for each category of expense of revenues that you're bringing in, right? So again, what are those categories? Things like local government, state government, federal government, tuition and fees, gifts, hospitals, auxiliary operations, other, that could be capital appropriations, other things. But as a general rule, the universities are going to have higher percentages. If we break down how much money goes to each category, their percentages are going to be higher for the auxiliary operations, tuition and fees, other gifts, and state government. So they're getting more state appropriations. The community college is typically going to have higher percentages for local government because they're usually being funded by the tax base in that town. Okay, so a model for calculating total revenue. So you look at state appropriations if it's a state institution, or if it's, so if it's private, it may or may not be receiving any. There are a few examples where privates do receive state appropriations, but for the most part, they don't. All right. Tuition and fees times the enrollment, whether that's full-time and part-time. So you kind of do the tuition and fees times the full-time enrollment, tuition and fees times part-time enrollment, add them together. Plus other revenue sources, right? So parking, housing, dining, any other way you're getting revenue to the institution. All right, subtracting the institutional financial aid. So because it's not really, if it's institutional money, it's usually not actual dollars. So it's usually counted as a tuition discount, scholarship, or just a discount. And so that's typically taken off of the revenue as opposed to carrying it as an expense. In terms of the costs and expenditures in higher ed, so those would be things like your direct costs, so things that you can directly attribute to something. Indirect costs would be more spread out over the college or university. Variable costs would be things that vary with the number, maybe with the enrollment or something like that. So, the more students you have, the more instructors you got to have. You have fixed costs as well. Some things you just have to pay for. Like there's some physical plant costs that they're pretty much fixed. But there are others that are more semi-variable. So there is some variability, but the authors give the example of during the workday, your physical plant costs are kind of a fixed cost, but operating them in the evenings would tend to be more incremental, so it becomes variable in that time period. Marginal cost is basically how much it costs to add an additional. It gives the example of enrolling another student in a class. How much more, if you're just enrolling one student, does it cost if that same instructor is going to teach all those students? They have access to the learning management system. What's the additional cost in terms of offering that service to that student? And then the average cost. So if you take the cost of something, divide it up over the total amount of people who use or benefit from it. It gives you an average. And those are different ways you can evaluate costs and expenditures. Is the average too high or too low based on some metric? Now, in terms of expenses, you break those down typically in operating expenses like research or instruction, public service, academic support, student services, physical plant, depreciation, institutional support, auxiliary operations, student aid, and other. So, in terms of what those are, so in general, the universities are going to have higher percentages of their expenses related to research, institutional support, and hospitals. Community colleges are typically going to have higher percentage of their expenditures related to things like student aid, student services, and instruction. And that shouldn't be too surprising in terms of the mission of those types of institutions. What's public service? So that's serving an external audience. Could be like public broadcasting. I know Tarleton has Tarleton Public Radio. Other institutions do things that are similar, and there's a cost associated with that. Institutional support, and so that includes what they call general and administrative expenditures, so G&A, and those are things that are non-academic. So things like the executive administration, running the administration, accounting, human resources, these are all considered institutional support. Auxiliary operations. All right, so these are self-supporting and fee-based. So they're essentially earning the money that they need in order to sustain themselves. But they are technically not related to the mission of the institution. So there are things like dining, housing. There's fees associated with that, but technically you can operate a college without housing or dining. But they help if you're going to have residential students, right? So student aid is listed on the expenditure side. Typically, if it is internal aid, that is typically considered, again, as we discussed earlier, on the revenue side. The external student aid is actually considered an expenditure. So it might not be intuitive to you, but just to know, that's where you might see it on a budget. Okay. So in a nutshell, that is our chapter on expenses and costs and revenue. And so I hope you found this helpful. I look forward to those of you who are in the class communicating with you in the chat for this week. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I hope you found this helpful. And I hope you'll like, subscribe, and share this video with folks that you think will find it helpful. All right, we'll see you in the next video. Bye.